Now, lipids get a bad rap because they're thought of as fats, but lipids actually have very important applications, such as serving as a structural component for the cell membrane, as I'm drawing right now. They also store energy, and they serve as signaling molecules. Lipids are hydrocarbons, which means that they're made up of primarily two elements. They're made up of hydrogen and they're made up of carbon, with small amounts of oxygen also found in their structure. But before I go into their structure, I'd like to tell you a little bit about lipids and how they're divided, because lipids can actually be divided in many ways. But in this specific lesson, we'll be dividing lipids up into 4 groups. We have fats, we have phospholipids, we have steroids, and finally we have waxes. So first, let's start off with fats. So I've drawn out the 2 parts of our fat. We have our glycerol, and we have our fatty acid. And when we combine the glycerol and the fatty acid, we create our fats. So fats and oil is our first subgroup. Now, when you look at the structure of this fatty acid, it helps you understand why lipids are made up of hydrocarbons, because there's such a high amount of hydrogen and carbon found in its structure. But before I go further about fatty acids, let's talk about how glycerol and these fatty acids come together to form these fats and oils. So, these hydroxyl groups should give you a hint into how this structure is formed. But before I talk about this, I'd like you to take a couple seconds or a minute to think about how the glycerol and the fatty acid come together. So now that you're back, I hope you remember from our first lesson about carbohydrates when I was talking about dehydration synthesis. Now, dehydration synthesis is a process where you have 2 hydroxyl groups which combine to create water and leave 1 oxygen behind as the link between the 2 structures. So in this, you have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen that leave to create water, and you're left with this oxygen. Now, the structure or the bond that is created between the glycerol and the fatty acid is called an ester bond. And this is because you have an acid bonded to the carbon. So our structure that is formed, as shown here, is called a triglyceride. And again, the name of the structure alludes to what the structure actually is. So tri helps you understand that there's 3 fatty acid, and then glyceride helps you understand that there is a glycerol found in this structure. Again, I'd like to point out that there are these ester bonds. And again, you can see that there's a high amount of hydrogen and carbon found in these structures. So now that I've talked a bit about the triglyceride, let me tell you a little bit about fatty acids, because there's actually multiple different types of fatty acids. So here I've drawn the 3 types of fatty acids. We have the first type, which is called a saturated fatty acid. And the reason why it's called a saturated fatty acid is because there's only single bonds between these carbons. And so it's saturated because the carbon has all of its bonds taken up. The next type of fatty acid is called a cis unsaturated fatty acid. And it's an unsaturated fatty acid because because we have a carbon here, which I've highlighted in red, that has a double bond. So all of its bonds are not taken up, or all of its bonds are not single bonds between different elements or different atoms. The final type of fatty acid is called a trans-unsaturated fatty acid. Now the difference between the cis and the trans-unsaturated fatty acid is that these hydrogens are on opposite sides. They're on opposite sides of the carbons. And because of this, they actually have different properties. So the saturated fatty acid is solid, the trans-unsaturated fatty acid is solid, and the cis-unsaturated fatty acid is liquid at room temperature. Now I'd like to show you a diagram to help you understand this. When you have these straight structures, when these are stacked on top of each other, like so, they can be stacked very close together. But with the addition of a cis-unsaturated fatty acid, there's more separation between these fatty acids, and thus they can't be as tightly packed at room temperature. In addition, trans-unsaturated fatty acids are formed through a process called hydrogenation. And it's a process where a liquid unsaturated fatty acid is attempted to be formed into a saturated fatty acid so that it's solid in room temperature. And when this occurs, you get these unnatural trans fatty acid as a byproduct during this hydrogenation. Now, cis unsaturated fatty acids are actually the most healthy. And this is because cis unsaturated fatty acids increase the amount of good cholesterol in your body. Next up is saturated fatty acids. And then you have trans unsaturated fatty acids. And these are extremely bad for you. And they can cause a buildup of bad cholesterol. And therefore, people try and limit the amount of trans unsaturated fatty acids that they consume. And many foods have a ban on this. In fact, the FDA has banned artificial trans fats in the US. Now the next structure I'll be talking about is a structure called a phospholipid. Let's write this out, a phospholipid. And again, the name alludes to the structure. So when you hear phosphate, you can tell that there's a phosphate side group or phosphate side group found in this structure. Again, a phosphate side group is charged, but a common characteristic of lipids is that they're either hydrophobic, which means they don't like water or they're not attracted to water, or amphipathic. And what this means is that they have both a hydrophobic, and a hydrophilic end. So a phospholipid is an example of this, because you have a charged part of the structure and a hydrophobic part of the structure made up of these hydrocarbons. And these hydrocarbons are uncharged, which is why commonly lipids are found as hydrophobic structures. An example of this is when you mix oil and water. They don't mix well. Actually, the oil and the water separate, and this is because they're hydrophobic. Now, the amphipathic nature of phospholipids is very helpful because it helps produce the structure called the Phospholipid Bilayer, which makes up the cell membrane. The way this works is, inside the cell you have cytoplasm, which has an amount of water. And outside the cell you also have an environment that has an amount of water. While this hydrophobic area does not allow a flow between these two environments. So the cytoplasm and the outside environment are kept away from each other due to this phospholipid bilayer. Now you still have the glycerol and the fatty acids, and these fatty acids can be either saturated or unsaturated. unsaturated. So we've gone over fats and oils and phospholipids. The final group we're going to be talking about are called steroids. And these aren't the steroids that you normally think of. In fact, the characteristics of steroids are that they have 4 carbon-linked rings, and that can be seen in this structure of cholesterol with these 4 carbon rings. And I haven't drawn the carbons in, but you by now should know that these corners are carbons. And then several of them, or many of them, have a short tail. And this tail can be seen here. Many steroids also have the classification of alcohol because they have an additional OH functional group. An OH functional group, or the hydroxyl group that I've talked about a lot as a side group. Another example of a steroid other than cholesterol is cortisol. You also have testosterone and estrogen. And these are common steroids that you can find in the body. Our final classification of lipids are waxes. Now, waxes are simple. They're simply long chains of these hydrocarbons attached to an acid. So you have your acid and your hydrocarbon. And again, you find a ester bond linking these two together. Waxes can be found on leaves to prevent the loss of water, and the hydrocarbon contains between 12 to 32 carbon atoms. So these are carbons, and I haven't labeled them again, and you should probably get used to this when you further see these structures in the future. So as a summary, lipids are made up of hydrocarbons, mainly hydrogen and carbon with the addition of oxygen, and the 4 groups that we've talked about are fats and oils, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. Specifically, we've talked a lot about fatty acids and the different characteristics of the different fatty acids. So we have saturated fatty acids and then cis and trans unsaturated fatty acids. And we've talked about the characteristics and the healthiness of these fatty acids. Well, thank you for joining us as we've looked at all of these biomolecules. And in the next lesson, we'll be taking a larger look at the cell, the organelles in the cell, and cellular processes.